So we're looking at Tom Morris's idea of God or concept of God. And though he does not make this explicit, it seems to me that Morris is presenting a methodology for thinking about the Christian God. Now, whether one's an atheist or a Christian or a theist of some other kind, this is meant as a way of understanding God in order to explore philosophical topics and problems related to the Christian God. So this would include the problem of evil or the rationality of faith or many others. So it's philosophical theology. It's an introduction to philosophical theology, and you see the details of where I'm getting this material on the screen. So we have a primitive concept of God that Morris appeals to initially. So what is that primitive idea? Well, a being on whom we depend, a being on whom everything, our world, depends. And so that's kind of an initial idea. But of course, Morris is not interested in polytheism. He's not interested in the kind of theism, for example, that the ancient Greeks had, and the ones that were criticized by Xenophanes and Aristotle. And Aristotle and Xenophanes' ideas are ones that Morris thinks are legitimate criticisms of polytheism. So instead, what we're looking at is monotheism. And broadly, he's trying to have an idea of God, a concept of God that's going to fit in with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, although we'll see that he's leaning towards Christianity here as he's developing the idea. And so rather than content itself, the goal is not to come up with a concept of God here, at least in the material we're coming. The goal is to describe the method of how we would identify a proper concept of God. What is needed in order to find that concept of God that makes the most sense? And so we're criticizing and examining, in the opposite order there, different methods of coming up with an idea of God. Now, the methods, of course, are going to be important. Now, Morris even compares the philosophical theology that he's doing with science, right? Science only flourishes after the reliability of the methodology is settled. Everybody agrees on how we're going to proceed. And intelligent and rational people, of course, can disagree about whether God exists or not and the nature of God. But if they don't agree on the same concept, if they're not sharing the same concept of God, then disagreements aren't going to be able to be communicated clearly. So we want to settle on the method, come to an idea of God that is clear, and then those problems and issues related to philosophy of religion, broadly speaking, can be addressed. So first suggestion that he considers. So this is something that some people might say, well, let's just look at all revealed theology, everything that is considered to be scripture or inspired. So we consult all purported revelations claimed by different religious traditions, and then we try to form a composite concept of God through those various revelations. Now, I think it's not hard to see that there's going to be some problems here. And one of the big problems is that many of the purported revelations are going to offer incompatible accounts of God, incompatible accounts of the divine, even to the point of, right, the number, right? Some are going to have several gods and some are going to only have one. So that is quickly ruled out as a methodology. So another idea that Morris has, he says, well, many people, and here it's clear he's talking about Christians, again, why I'm limiting this to a Christian God, even though he purports not to, that he's appealing to maybe purely biblical theology. So the method here is that we only use what's included in the Bible to form our concept of God. So it's whatever we get from Scripture, that's going to tell us what God is like, and that's our sole source. Now, the problem here is that there are some questions, in fact, I would say many questions, philosophically speaking, that the Bible was not intended to answer, right? The Bible's not a textbook on philosophical theology. It's not a philosophical work. And even though there are many arguments and philosophical ideas, that's not the main goal of the Bible. So there are going to be incomplete answers to very reasonable questions. So Morris wants to make it clear, it doesn't mean that there are illegitimate philosophical questions that believers should ask and pursue. Now, some people take that path. They say, well, if there are questions that can't be answered by the Bible, then that's a question that we shouldn't be addressing. But clearly, interested philosophers aren't going to take that path, and they say that certainly there are philosophical questions that can't be addressed by the Bible. So what do you do? What's another option? Well, another option is this idea of creation theology that Morris explains as such. So the idea is, in order to explain the existence of the universe, we postulate, we make an hypothesis, and we say, well, here's what would explain the universe: the existence of a cause whose nature and activity would be sufficient to explain the production of the cosmos. So we postulate something that exists and is the cause of the universe that we're familiar with. Now, there are some strengths to this methodology. One, it does seem to have revelational support, right? That God created heavens and earth and everything that exists in it, everything that's created. An additional strength of this approach is it does kind of mirror the methodology of science. Now, if you take that to the extreme, however, we're going to have some challenges. And so there are problems pretty clearly with creation theology. One is that it's going to be very incomplete. If that's all you're doing to get a concept of God, there are going to be things left out. For example, many people would want to ascribe power to God to do more than simply create the universe. Now, that's one. I think a bigger problem is that it provides no basis for the moral or the personal attributes of God, ideas such as God being good or loving or merciful or just, able to enter into relationships, having goals or plans or values. And so without that, you're lacking a lot of ideas that a Christian would say God has. So that seems to be an incomplete approach. What else could we do? Well, Morris suggests a kind of a comprehensive explanatory theology. So what we do is we take the creation theology of method 3, and then the explananda are going to also include the occurrences in human history. So what we're trying to explain are going to also be miracles or signs of providential intent, or the varieties and various religious experiences that individuals have. And then we explain those, right? What would explain those, as well as explaining the creation and the existence of the universe. Now, a problem here is that this approach is still going to fall short of a lot of the claims that most theists, and of course, in particular, Christians, would include about the concept of God. And we've already mentioned a few of those that still seem to be somewhat problematic. So maybe we could adjust this approach, this comprehensive approach, and appeal to revelation also. So now we're kind of building back in previous attempts, right? Previous approaches, and combining them. So that was the motivation for method 1. We have the revelational theology. We also include method 3. We have the creation theology. We expand that out to explain how do we explain other things that seem to be explicable by God acting in the universe. And so it's much more comprehensive here, and that's why he calls it comprehensive explanatory theology. So this is going to include, right, it addresses that problem that we said about lacking a personal and moral attributes. So this would include that scripture that describes God as righteous or gracious or compassionate or just or loving and so on. Those attributes then will be included in our concept of God. Now, that seems to be fairly comprehensive, but Morris says it's still going to leave a lot of philosophical questions unanswered. And so even though there might be good ideas included there, we still don't have everything that we want. So he suggests a different approach. Now, this is not unique to Morris by any means. He's suggesting perfect being theology, where we use as a starting thesis this idea that God is the greatest possible being. Now, those of you familiar with philosophy of religion already say, well, we know where this idea is from. Right? This approach is clearly inspired by Anselm, who described God as the being than which none greater can be conceived. Earlier philosophical thinkers also had an idea somewhat similar to this. Certainly Augustine did, Avicenna did, other medievalists did as well. And so we begin with the main idea that God has maximal perfection. That's perfect being theology. Now, of course, the attributes that we're going to ascribe to God cannot be contradictory. So this is what Morris comes up with. After the various methodologies that he's considered, he comes up with this idea that God is the being with the greatest possible array of compossible great-making properties, right? The maximally good being that isn't going to have contradictory properties, but otherwise has the maximally great properties that are good for a being to have. And then we flesh out what that means by reflecting on that idea. So that's what he settles on for his method. Now, in part 2, we'll consider some further developments of this idea, some challenges and some current concerns related to this idea.